In Jung's private Zurich notes, he described a transformation so profound he called it the most dangerous evolution of the human psyche. Most people never reach it. You're hearing this because some part of you might be on that same path. But here's the question Jung left unanswered. What happens when an empath stops absorbing pain and begins to study it? And another, even harder one. When compassion becomes conscious, does it remain compassion, or does it turn into power? Jung had seen it only a handful of times in his clinical life. He wrote about certain patients, mostly quiet, intuitive, unnervingly observant, who appeared fragile at first glance. They cried easily, they apologized for existing, yet when their suffering reached a breaking point, something extraordinary ignited behind their gentleness. The patient who once dissolved into other people's moods began to map them with surgical precision. The empath became, in Jung's words, a psychological strategist disguised as sensitivity. He noticed that these individuals possessed a hidden faculty, an almost scientific curiosity about human behavior. While others felt to survive, they felt to understand. Their pain didn't just hurt, it gathered data. Every betrayal, every manipulation, every silence became a lesson in emotional anatomy. Jung's case journals from this period describe them as apprentice alchemists, turning despair into awareness molecule by molecule. In his Zurich practice between 1919 and 1926, Jung documented what he called the empathic inversion, a reversal in the flow of psychic energy. Instead of letting the collective unconscious flood them, these empaths learned to redirect that current inward, to study, distill, and integrate what once drowned them. The result was astonishing. They began to display the same analytical detachment as trained analysts, but without losing the warmth of feeling. It was empathy upgraded to consciousness. Modern psychology still struggles to define this phenomenon. Empaths are typically framed as victims of overstimulation, but Jung saw them as prototypes of a new psychic structure, humans evolving toward total awareness of emotional fields. He compared their nervous systems to living instruments tuned to the collective tone of humanity. What destroyed the ordinary person was precisely what refined them. He warned, however, that this refinement was perilous. Once awareness sharpens beyond a certain threshold, the empath begins to see behind every mask, social, romantic, even spiritual. The illusions that make ordinary life bearable start to dissolve. Relationships built on unconscious agreements begin to collapse. The empath's world becomes transparent, and with transparency comes both freedom and unbearable responsibility. Many of Jung's colleagues dismissed these notes as mystical exaggeration, yet he insisted the transformation was real and reproducible. It followed a pattern: extreme emotional identification, collapse, detachment, reintegration. What made it dangerous, he said, was not the pain, but the clarity. To see too much, he wrote, is to stand on the threshold of godlike perception with a human heart. Most people, he believed, would turn back at that threshold. They'd numb themselves, revert to ordinary empathy, or drown in cynicism. But a rare few kept walking. Those were the ones he called the conscious empaths. They learned to sense energy the way a physicist reads vibrations. They could enter a room and register who was lying, who was in grief, who was quietly disintegrating, yet remain internally still. Not detached, but sovereign. They didn't suppress emotion. They transmuted it into comprehension. And so Jung began to ask himself a question that haunted him until his final years. What happens when sensitivity becomes sentience? When feeling itself becomes a form of intelligence? He suspected this was not merely a psychological adaptation, but an evolutionary event, a new stage in human awareness emerging through the crucible of pain. The empath, once a victim of emotion, was becoming a motion scientist. That, Jung warned, is where the real danger begins. Because once you can read the unconscious motives of others, you can influence them. Once you see the architecture of manipulation, you can construct or dismantle it at will. Power begins to flow toward you naturally, not because you seek it, but because perception itself is power. He recorded in one of his final Zurich notebooks, "The evolved empath stands at a crossroads, either servant of consciousness or seducer of it." In the next chapter, we'll explore what triggers this transformation, the betrayal that breaks the old empath open and forces the birth of the new one. Jung wrote that every empath's transformation begins with what he termed the clarity event. It arrives disguised as devastation, betrayal, rejection, or abandonment so precise it feels surgical. To the untrained psyche, it looks like collapse, but to Jung, it was the psyche's method of initiating individuation through emotional disillusionment. In his Zurich case files, he described it as the psyche's own rebellion against unconscious servitude. The empath, long accustomed to interpreting others' needs before their own, suddenly encounters a moment where their intuition fails, not because it is broken, but because it has completed its old function. The emotional radar that once kept them safe now becomes obsolete. The soul, Jung said, must break the instrument to upgrade it. It usually happens through another person, someone the empath trusted entirely, a friend who weaponizes their vulnerability, a lover who mirrors their depth until they see themselves reflected in illusion, or a mentor whose admiration masks quiet envy. When the betrayal strikes, the empath's nervous system experiences something close to psychic shock. The external world collapses into unbearable clarity. I have been reading others so well, the empath thinks, yet I never saw this coming. Jung believed this moment was sacred, the collapse of projection, the withdrawal of misplaced empathy. It is the psyche reclaiming energy that had been invested in someone else's story. What follows is emotional silence, a vacuum where the empath's previous identity dissolves. For many, this feels like death, but Jung saw it differently. What dies here is only the false self, the self addicted to understanding others at the expense of understanding itself. In his notes from 1922, he compared this phase to alchemical calcination, the burning away of impurities until only the essential element remains. During this period, the empath's perception temporarily intensifies to unbearable levels. Sounds feel sharper, emotions louder, intuition hyperactive. But instead of drowning in them, a shift occurs. Observation replaces absorption. The empath begins to witness emotion without merging with it. This shift is crucial. Jung observed that when consciousness learns to witness feeling instead of becoming it, a new psychic function emerges, what he called reflective empathy. It's empathy refined through awareness, no longer reactive but investigative. The empath begins to notice patterns in the emotional weather around them. Why do certain people always carry storms? Why do they, the empath, attract certain wounds repeatedly? This is the beginning of pattern literacy. Jung called it psychic analytics born of suffering. The empath realizes that emotions are data, living equations that reveal unconscious motives. Every sigh, every silence, every tone of voice becomes evidence in a larger psychological investigation. And then comes the first true danger, insight without balance. When you suddenly see everything, every hidden intention, every manipulation, every unspoken resentment, the temptation to withdraw completely becomes overwhelming. The empath risks transforming from healer into hermit, from compassionate witness into detached observer. Jung warned about this in a 1925 lecture. To see without love is the first stage of inner corrosion. Many of his patients did withdraw. They built emotional fortresses and called it enlightenment. But the rare ones, the ones he wrote about with almost reverence, discovered another path. Instead of retreating from the world, they learned to stand in it consciously. They allowed the pain to remain visible without letting it define them. Jung compared them to tempered steel, forged by fire, but flexible enough not to shatter. He noted that these individuals developed a distinct quality of stillness. When they speak, he wrote, others feel the echo of their own conscience. Their words carry weight not because they are loud, but because they emerge from clarity purchased through suffering. This is where the empath's identity shifts from emotional responder to psychological analyst. They begin to interpret life symbolically, understanding that each betrayal was an encoded message from the self. The person who hurt them becomes a mirror reflecting the parts of themselves they had abandoned. And in that realization, power begins to return. Quietly, gradually, without vengeance. The empath stops searching for justice and starts studying justice. They observe human behavior the way a naturalist studies ecosystems, with fascination instead of fixation. Every manipulator becomes a case study in unmet needs. Every liar, an example of ego defense in motion. This isn't detachment, it's evolution. Jung believed that once the empath learns to map emotional patterns without drowning in them, they cross the threshold into true individuation. Feeling becomes knowing, compassion becomes discernment, and discernment, when anchored in love, becomes wisdom. But this wisdom carries a shadow, because to know human nature this intimately is to hold the blueprint of influence. The empath who reaches this stage faces a choice: use their insight to heal or to control. Jung warned, the awakened empath must now confront the shadow of their own power. That confrontation is where we'll go next, into the empath's strategist phase, where compassion meets intellect and the line between healer and manipulator grows dangerously thin. Jung once wrote that, when empathy gains intellect, the psyche enters its most volatile chemistry. He was describing what he called the strategist phase, a psychological metamorphosis where compassion fuses with cognition and produces something entirely new: conscious influence. Until this point, the empath has lived primarily in response. They've felt the emotions of others before those emotions were even named. But now, something radical begins to occur. Awareness starts to anticipate rather than absorb. The empath's mind, sharpened by pain and silence, begins to see patterns before they unfold. They no longer react to energy, they predict it. They begin to understand that every human interaction is an exchange of psychic data. Tone, posture, pauses, all transmit information. Jung believed that this level of perception represents a quantum leap in emotional evolution. The empath becomes not merely receptive but analytical, capable of navigating the collective unconscious with near scientific precision. He described this stage through the image of the strategist's war room. Inside it, the empath maps emotional topographies the way a general maps terrain. Each recurring conflict, each difficult person, each heartbreak is charted like a constellation of meaning. Over time, a pattern emerges. Humanity's emotional wars are predictable. The empath realizes that what most people call chaos is simply unrecognized repetition. This is when power first makes its offer, because with pattern recognition comes potential manipulation. The empath who understands the machinery of emotion can choose which strings to pull, which silences to let hang in the air, which truths to reveal or withhold. They can shape perception without ever raising their voice. Jung called this the temptation of lucidity, the ego's desire to use awareness for control rather than connection. Some of his Zurich patients fell into this trap. After awakening to their insight, they began to test it. They'd predict people's reactions, steer conversations, withdraw affection to observe dependency. Jung saw this as the shadow of empathy, the transformation of understanding into strategy. When one sees too deeply, he wrote, one begins to play God within the small theater of relationships. But the ones who passed the test did something different. They chose observation over domination. They treated their insight as sacred responsibility rather than personal weapon. To them, clarity became a form of service. Jung described these individuals as psychological healers, whose silence reorders the unconscious field. They didn't speak more, they radiated more. Presence replaced persuasion. If you've ever met someone who makes you feel seen without needing to say much, you've felt this energy. It's not charisma, it's coherence. The empath in the strategist phase emanates stability because their internal chaos has been studied, understood, and integrated. They have learned the architecture of pain so thoroughly that they no longer need to project it onto others. Still, this stage remains perilous. Power tests purity. The empath, now capable of influencing outcomes, must confront subtle pride. The sense of, I know more than others, becomes the new ego trap. Jung warned that the danger of consciousness is inflation. It's easy to believe that awareness equals superiority, but true mastery, he said, is humility within vision, the ability to see everything and still bow to mystery. Those who succeed develop what Jung called ethical empathy, a disciplined awareness guided by principle. They understand that insight without ethics is psychological sorcery, so they construct inner boundaries as carefully as outer ones. Before speaking, they ask, will this truth liberate or dominate? Before acting, they consider, is this clarity born of compassion or fear? Jung admired these individuals because they embodied integration, the union of heart and intellect. They think with feeling, he wrote, and feel with thought. Their minds don't override their emotions. They translate them into language the world can understand. This synthesis gives rise to a new form of communication. Words from such a person no longer function merely as sound. They carry energetic correction. When they say, I understand, It's not consolation, it's recognition. When they remain silent, it's not withdrawal, it's calibration. Their empathy becomes a tuning fork that harmonizes the unconscious vibrations around them. Yet Jung cautioned that this harmony is not permanent. The strategist must continually return to humility through solitude. Without regular descent into silence, insight ossifies into arrogance. The empath must keep dissolving the ego that knowledge constructs. That's why Jung advised his advanced patients to cultivate rituals of unlearning, moments when they release the need to interpret and simply be. He noted that when the empath integrates this rhythm, analysis balanced by surrender, the psyche achieves a strange equilibrium. They can walk through emotional storms without absorbing them, engage conflict without hostility, and perceive truth without judgment. The nervous system that once trembled under collective weight now becomes a stabilizing field. Others unconsciously regulate themselves in their presence. It's here that Jung began to glimpse what he called the empathic sage, a person whose sensitivity has been refined into wisdom. But even this, he warned, is not the final stage, because after the strategist phase comes the confrontation with power's reflection, the shadow of righteousness, the subtle corruption of being needed. For when others start turning to you for guidance, when your insight becomes currency, the ego returns in sacred disguise. And that, Jung said, is the most dangerous threshold of all. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the awakened empath faces this final shadow, the seduction of being the savior and the inner death required to transcend it. Jung once said that every healer must eventually face their secret addiction, the need to be needed. He called it the final shadow of compassion, the moment when empathy, having survived its pain and mastered its power, risks becoming righteous. This is the corruption of light disguised as service. By the time the empath reaches this phase, they are often admired. Friends seek their advice, strangers confide their pain, and their calm presence feels like medicine. But beneath this grace lies a subtle danger. The empath begins to draw energy not from drama anymore, but from purpose. They start to believe they exist to rescue others from themselves. It sounds noble, it feels divine. Yet Jung warned, when the healer cannot bear the suffering of others without intervening, the shadow has changed its costume. This stage begins innocently. Someone broken crosses your path. You recognize their wounds instantly. The abandonment, the shame, the self-loathing. You've been there. You know the map out. And so you offer light. At first it feels sacred, even fated. But soon you notice the exchange has changed. Their healing becomes your identity. Their dependence feeds your sense of worth. Without realizing it, the empath has replaced the need for love with the need for significance. In his 1933 seminar notes, Jung wrote, "The savior complex is the ego's most sophisticated disguise. It wears the mask of virtue to avoid confronting its own unfinished pain." The empath who has not yet forgiven themselves for past helplessness will unconsciously seek redemption through saving others. They mistake compassion for completion. But every time they rescue someone from their own evolution, they steal the soul's opportunity for growth. This realization can shatter the spiritual ego. The empath must face the unbearable truth. Not everyone is meant to be saved, and sometimes help is harm. Jung believed this is where true individuation begins, not in healing others, but in learning to let their suffering exist without collapsing under it. He called this holding space for the dark without trying to repaint it. In this crucible, a paradox unfolds. To stay loving, the empath must detach from outcome. To remain kind, they must stop rescuing. To remain powerful, they must surrender control. It feels like betrayal of their very nature, yet it's the opposite. This surrender is what purifies love of possession. Compassion becomes clean, free from the ego's interference. Jung likened this purification to the alchemical stage of separation. The heart and the will, once fused, must now divide so that a higher synthesis can occur. The empath learns to distinguish between love that liberates and love that binds. The first says, "I trust your path." The second says, "I know better than your path." One creates evolution, the other, dependency. During this period, many empaths experience deep exhaustion, not because they are depleted, but because the psyche is withdrawing energy from roles that no longer serve. The identity of the helper begins to dissolve. Relationships shift. Some people who once leaned on them disappear. Others accuse them of becoming cold, distant, or selfish. Jung called this the purification by misinterpretation. When you stop overgiving, Those attached to your compliance will call it betrayal. Yet this loneliness is sacred. It's the silence before integration, the moment the psyche recalibrates around authenticity. Jung observed that after the savior complex collapses, the empath undergoes a strange rebirth. Their compassion remains, but now it moves differently. It no longer rushes to fill every void. It observes first, then chooses. He wrote, "Conscious love hesitates before it gives. Unconscious love pours itself out and calls it virtue. Here, discernment becomes devotion. The empath learns to sense not just pain but readiness. They no longer offer insight to those who seek attention instead of truth. They no longer waste energy translating wisdom for ears that cannot yet hear. They recognize that silence itself can be medicine, that sometimes the most compassionate act is to let the wound speak for itself." Jung referred to this stage as the formation of sacred boundaries. These are not defenses built from fear, but structures built from respect, for the autonomy of others and the sanctity of the self. The evolved empath becomes an initiator rather than a savior. They don't remove pain, they reveal its purpose. They don't give answers, they awaken questions. This is the first glimpse of what Jung called ethical sovereignty, the state in which the individual's energy is fully self-governed. The empath no longer bleeds unconsciously into the collective field. They channel energy with intention, precision, and grace. From this inner sovereignty emerges a strange serenity. Others may interpret it as distance, but it's actually containment. The empath has learned the art of holding immense love without losing form. Jung saw this as the psyche's true adulthood. Only when love ceases to drown, he wrote, can it truly heal. But the story doesn't end here. Because once the empath attains this equilibrium, another paradox appears. The world begins to change its response. People who once drained them now seek their presence. Environments that once overwhelmed them become neutral. Manipulators retreat without confrontation. Jung realized that consciousness itself alters reality. The outer world rearranges around the inner vibration of self-trust. And this, he believed, is when the empath steps into their highest test, to live without needing approval, to walk through the collective field as both participant and witness, to feel everything without being owned by anything. In the next chapter, we enter that stage, the empath's rebirth into calm clarity, where emotion becomes intelligence and boundaries become portals of power. Jung believed that the moment an empath stops defining themselves through the suffering of others, a new center of gravity is born inside them. He called it the axis of self-trust. This marks the rebirth, the beginning of emotional sovereignty. The empath, who once absorbed every frequency around them, now emanates one of their own. It is a strange sensation, at first almost alien. Imagine living your entire life as an instrument tuned to the moods of others, and then suddenly hearing your own sound. The silence that follows is not emptiness, it's clarity. Jung described this as the still point within the storm. The psyche no longer reacts, it orchestrates. In this state, the empath's nervous system recalibrates. They feel deeply, but no longer drown. They perceive emotion as information rather than identity. Where once they merged unconsciously, they now choose consciously. A friend's sadness, a lover's anger, a stranger's projection. These no longer infiltrate the empath's inner world without permission. The boundary is no longer external. It's energetic, invisible, effortless. Jung called this shift the transcendent function at work, the psyche's ability to hold opposites in harmony. Feeling and thinking, empathy and detachment, love and logic no longer war within. They cooperate. The empath becomes whole, and wholeness changes everything. At this level, their perception expands beyond individuals. They begin to read collective fields, atmospheres of rooms, emotional weather of communities, even the unspoken tension between nations. It's as if their intuition has become a satellite dish for human consciousness itself, but instead of being overwhelmed, they process these frequencies through awareness. Jung wrote, "The individuated soul becomes a tuning fork for the unconscious of humanity." From this awareness emerges a new expression of power, subtle, nonlinear, and profoundly creative. The empath no longer seeks validation through helping others. They begin shaping reality through vibration. They understand that their inner coherence influences the external field. When they stay calm in chaos, chaos recalibrates. When they choose compassion over reaction, the pattern of conflict itself begins to dissolve. Jung hinted that this ability might be the next step in human evolution, conscious participation in the collective psyche. When an individual becomes whole, he wrote, they heal a fragment of the world. The evolved empath becomes a quiet revolutionary, changing systems not by protest but by presence. Their very being becomes their activism. But this wholeness doesn't make life easy. In fact, it reveals new layers of solitude. Few can meet them in this depth of perception. Conversations that once felt rich now echo with superficiality. Social roles feel like costumes. Jung noted that many of his advanced patients experienced this as existential displacement, the awareness of living among people still governed by illusions they themselves have outgrown. He warned them not to confuse maturity with superiority. The moment you believe you are beyond others, you've fallen back into duality. The purpose of awakening is not escape, but integration. The empath must learn to walk among the unawakened with humility, to feel compassion without condescension, to see ignorance without judgment, to remain luminous without needing to be recognized. At this point, the empath's relationship with emotion transforms completely. Feelings that once overwhelmed, anger, grief, fear, become alchemical ingredients. When rage arises, they study its origin. When sorrow comes, they listen to its message. When fear speaks, they translate it into awareness. Jung described this as psychological alchemy, turning emotional lead into gold. This is where creativity awakens. Many who reach this stage suddenly begin to write, paint, compose, teach, or heal. The energy that once leaked through endless empathy now channels into expression. Their art, their presence, their work, all carry the unmistakable vibration of integration. People feel peace around them without knowing why. Jung said, when the soul reconciles its opposites, its mere existence becomes instruction. It's important to note, this serenity is not suppression. The empath still feels pain, loss, injustice, but now without fragmentation. Pain no longer questions their worth. It becomes evidence of their humanity. They can hold joy and grief in the same breath without breaking. This emotional simultaneity, Jung believed, is the essence of enlightenment, not the absence of suffering, but the conscious coexistence with it. And with that coexistence comes an unexpected grace, forgiveness. Not the performative kind that demands forgetting, but the organic realization that everything, even betrayal, was part of the curriculum. The empath sees their past as an intricate initiation, every wound a doorway, every loss a teacher. They recognize that those who hurt them were merely instruments of their awakening. This recognition doesn't erase boundaries, it sanctifies them. The empath forgives without re-entering toxic cycles, loves without surrendering discernment, and walks away without hatred. Jung called this the sovereignty of the healed heart. Here, emotional independence and compassion merge into one current. The empath becomes their own sanctuary. They no longer need validation to confirm their goodness or suffering to confirm their depth. Their peace no longer depends on circumstances. It radiates from within. But Jung warned that this balance must be maintained through continual self-observation. Consciousness, like fire, must be tended. Without humility, the empath risks drifting into detachment once again, mistaking calm for superiority, neutrality for numbness. True mastery, he wrote, is the ability to feel everything without the need to react to anything. In this equilibrium, power no longer feels like dominance, it feels like stillness. The empath's presence becomes directive without being forceful, firm without being rigid. People sense boundaries they cannot cross without a single word spoken. The energy field itself communicates, I am here, but I am not yours. And yet, as Jung observed, even this serenity is not the final state. There remains one last initiation, the confrontation with meaning itself. For when the empath has transcended fear, manipulation, and dependence, the psyche presents its final challenge. What now? If empathy no longer wounds you, if perception no longer confuses you, what will you do with your power? That, Jung said, is the threshold between awakening and destiny, the point where consciousness must decide whether it will serve life or simply admire its own reflection. In the next chapter, we step into that final test, the empath's confrontation with purpose, the passage from mastery to mission. Jung wrote that after an individual attains equilibrium, life itself delivers the final initiation, purpose. He called it the return to the world. For the empath who has mastered emotion and withdrawn from illusion, this moment arrives as a quiet summons. It doesn't come from ambition or desire, but from an inner necessity, the self-seeking expression through service. Up to this point, the empath's journey has been inward, through wounding, awareness, integration, and sovereignty. Now consciousness begins to turn outward again, but this time without dependence. Jung believed that the individuated person must re-enter the collective, not to be consumed by it, but to illuminate it. Wholeness, he said, is incomplete until it contributes. This stage often begins with a peculiar restlessness. Everything appears stable, the emotions balanced, boundaries strong, relationships peaceful, yet a subtle unease stirs beneath the calm. The empath senses that mastery was never the destination, only preparation. What once felt like arrival now feels like waiting. Jung identified this restlessness as the call of the self toward meaningful participation. Awareness demands application. At first, many resist. After so much inner labor, the idea of returning to a world still steeped in projection and unconsciousness feels exhausting, but resistance only amplifies the summons. Dreams begin to repeat, synchronicities multiply, books, people, and opportunities appear as coded instructions. Jung noted that this is how the psyche communicates destiny, through patterned coincidence that feels both random and inevitable. The empath soon realizes that purpose isn't a profession, it's a vibration. It's not what you do, it's the consciousness you bring to whatever you do. The evolved empath could be a teacher, artist, healer, scientist, parent, or quiet neighbor. It doesn't matter. What matters is the energetic intention behind each act. Jung wrote, "When the self expresses through vocation, the ordinary becomes sacrament. But even this stage carries danger, for meaning can become another identity. The ego that once clung to victimhood can just as easily cling to virtue. The empath may begin to identify as the conscious one, mistaking purpose for superiority." Jung warned that this inflation of the spiritual ego is more destructive than ignorance itself because it masquerades as enlightenment. The devil, he said, often appears wearing the halo of purpose. To prevent this inflation, life introduces another test: invisibility. The empath may find that their contributions go unnoticed, their insights misunderstood, their light ignored. Projects stall, recognition fades, people withdraw. It is the universe's way of purifying intention. Are you serving because it fulfills your soul, or because it feeds your significance? Those who pass this test rediscover humility. They realize that purpose isn't performance, it's participation. They no longer need validation because they experience meaning as an internal continuity. Every small act, listening deeply, creating beauty, speaking truth, tending the ordinary, becomes part of a larger choreography of consciousness. Jung called this living symbolically, the recognition that life itself is the ritual of the soul. At this level, synchronicity becomes constant. The empath feels guided not by logic but by rhythm. They sense when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when silence is the truer language. Decisions no longer arise from fear of loss but from resonance. Jung believed that this alignment with inner timing is the sign that the ego now serves the self completely, and yet awareness at this altitude carries solitude of another kind, the loneliness of clarity amid confusion. The empath sees the unconscious machinery of society, the collective hunger for distraction, the glamorization of false empathy, the commodification of spirituality. Jung foresaw this, warning that the enlightened individual must endure misunderstanding from the world they are sent to serve. Still, the mature empath does not withdraw. They walk among the noise as a still point, anchoring sanity where hysteria rules, embodying coherence where fragmentation dominates. They do not preach, they demonstrate. Their very presence becomes a stabilizing field. Jung described this as the silent ministry of consciousness. This ministry has no followers, only witnesses. Some will be drawn to it and change without knowing why. Others will resist it and project their shadows. But the empath, now free from reaction, holds both with equal grace. They have transcended the polarity of praise and rejection. Neither defines them, neither disturbs them. At this point, the empath's relationship with destiny itself changes. They stop asking, "What is my purpose?" and begin asking, "What does purpose want through me?" This shift marks the passage from egoic mission to divine orchestration. Jung called it the surrender of authorship, the realization that life is writing through you, not about you. And then, something miraculous happens. The world, which once mirrored their chaos, begins to mirror their coherence. Opportunities align effortlessly. People arrive at the exact moment they are ready. The empath no longer pushes outcomes, they magnetize them. Jung noted that when inner order is achieved, external events organize around it. The psyche and the universe, finally in conversation, create a field of synchronic destiny. From here, life feels less like a path and more like a partnership. Every challenge becomes dialogue. Every coincidence feels instructional. Even pain returns, but now as refinement rather than punishment. The empath understands that evolution never ends, it only deepens. Jung concluded that this stage represents the psyche's entrance into conscious collaboration with creation itself. The empath is no longer a student of pain or even a teacher of wisdom. They have become a participant in the evolution of consciousness. And yet, there is one more step, perhaps the most dangerous of all, to use this awareness ethically in a world still asleep. For when others begin to sense your calm and call it authority, when your words start to shape collective thought, the line between influence and manipulation reappears. In the next and final part, we'll explore that threshold, how Jung believed the awakened empath must walk the razor's edge between wisdom and power, and why he called this the most perilous grace a human soul can carry. In his final Zurich lectures, Jung spoke quietly of what he called the perilous grace. It was the last threshold, the moment when awareness becomes influence. The empath who has integrated their wounds, mastered discernment, and embodied peace now discovers that their very consciousness alters others. People listen differently, rooms shift when they enter, their stillness becomes a mirror that reveals everyone else's unrest. And that, Jung warned, is where danger lives, because power wrapped in virtue is the hardest power to detect, especially by the one who carries it. Jung's notes describe this stage as the confrontation with divine inflation. It's the temptation to believe that because you can see into others, you have the right to guide them, that your clarity is their compass. It begins subtly. You offer advice that feels inspired. You shape outcomes that seem benevolent. You sense what someone needs before they ask. You call it intuition, but underneath, the ego stirs again, this time wearing light. He wrote, "The final test of the awakened empath is whether they can hold influence without exercising it, to remain a vessel, not a ruler, to speak only when truth demands, not when validation tempts. It's not about denying your power, it's about staying transparent enough for power to flow through without residue of control." Jung believed that the universe itself monitors this integrity. The moment the empath begins to manipulate, even for noble reasons, life sends correction. Sudden conflicts appear, plans collapse, people withdraw. It is the psyche's immune response protecting consciousness from corruption. The self, Jung said, will destroy the persona that tries to impersonate it. So the evolved empath learns restraint, the highest form of mastery. They realize that awareness does not need to perform. Influence that comes from purity doesn't announce itself, it simply radiates. The true teacher doesn't convert, they illuminate. The truly powerful empath doesn't dominate energy, they harmonize it. At this stage, something remarkable occurs. The empath ceases to identify even with being an empath. The label dissolves. Sensitivity, which once felt like burden, then gift, then tool, now simply becomes nature. They no longer observe themselves transforming, they are transformation itself. The psyche has completed its alchemy. Feeling and intellect, shadow and light, self and other, merged into one continuum of awareness. Jung called this the self-realized through relation. The empath's consciousness now operates as a bridge between dimensions of human experience, instinct and intuition, matter and meaning, individual and collective. They exist not above life, but within it, fully awake. And in that wakefulness, the two questions from the beginning finally answer themselves. What happens when an empath stops absorbing pain and begins to study it? They become free, not hardened, not detached, but lucid. Pain no longer colonizes their identity. It becomes data, holy, instructive, and finite. Through understanding, the empath transforms victimhood into vision. They no longer feel the world's wounds as a weight, but as information guiding their compassion with precision. And when compassion becomes conscious, does it remain compassion or does it turn into power? It becomes both, intertwined as one force. Conscious compassion is power, the rarest kind because it requires no domination. It heals not by effort but by presence. It influences not through persuasion but through coherence. Power without love corrupts. Love without power exhausts. But when love becomes conscious, it transcends both. Jung saw in these individuals the prototype of a new psychological species, humans capable of feeling everything without being destroyed by anything. They were what he called the luminous ones, emissaries of integration walking quietly among us. Not saints, not prophets, but living evidence that the psyche can evolve beyond polarity. He concluded, when consciousness and compassion unite, the human being approaches divinity, but must remain human to survive it. That's why he called this stage dangerous, not because it leads to destruction, but because it demands relentless self-honesty. The moment you stop observing your motives, the light turns into shadow again. Awareness must stay alive, breathing, questioning. The evolved empath lives this questioning daily. They hold their insights like fire, knowing it warms but also burns. They practice humility as spiritual hygiene. When gratitude replaces superiority, when silence replaces preaching, when curiosity replaces certainty, that's when the danger transforms back into grace. Such a person becomes paradox itself, soft yet unbreakable, detached yet deeply loving, invisible yet unmistakably felt. They walk through chaos like steady flame, healing not by intention, but by existence. People sense them and remember something ancient, something their souls have been trying to recall. That sensitivity is not weakness and love is not surrender. It is the raw material of awakening. So if you're here listening to these words, it's not coincidence, it's recognition. Some part of you has been traveling this same interior map. You've already passed the first tests, the heartbreak, the disillusionment, the clarity that made old lives impossible. And if this message resonates, it's because the next threshold is near. The dangerous empath is not someone to fear. They are what humanity is becoming. Emotion fused with awareness, compassion refined into wisdom, feeling transformed into conscious creation. You were never too sensitive. You were training for sight, and now you see.